The land was flat and endless, a sea of cotton under a sun that never seemed to rest. The year was 1847, and Mississippi's fields rolled like white waves, stretching past every horizon of the enslaved mind. Here the soil was red and cruelly fertile, drinking both rain and blood with equal thirst. On the vast Bellamy Plantation, more than 200 enslaved men, women, and children bent their backs beneath that burning sky, their songs rising and falling like prayers muffled by dust. Among them worked a boy named Samuel, barely 16, tall for his age, lean with muscle carved from years of toil, his skin glistening with the same sweat that had once belonged to his father before the lash took him. His mother had told him that freedom was not a place but a fire, a small secret thing you carried inside until the right wind helped it spread. Samuel learned early that silence was survival. Every day began before dawn when the overseer's horn broke the fragile peace of darkness. The quarters stirred with groans, whispers, and the rustle of chains as bodies rose from dirt floors and rough blankets. He remembered how his mother, Lena, used to braid his hair and murmur, "Keep your head low, son. Put your eyes open." She was gone now, sold 3 years past to a Louisiana trader after she refused the master's advances. He never saw her again, but every night he thought he heard her voice in the rustle of the cypress trees beyond the fields. The Bellamy Plantation was a small empire of cruelty hidden behind the elegance of its columns. The master, Judge Horace Bellamy, was a man of law and scripture who justified his wealth through both. His words dripped honey in public, but his hands were cold iron in private. His overseer, Carter Finch, carried a whip like it was part of his body, its handle polished from years of use. The sound of that whip was a kind of language on the plantation, one everyone understood without words. When it cracked, someone's hope split with it. Samuel's work was to tend the irrigation trenches, his bare feet sinking into the mud as he dragged buckets from one end of the field to another. He had once asked why the water couldn't flow on its own, and for that, Carter struck him so hard across the mouth that his tooth loosened. "Because it's your water to carry," Carter said. That night Samuel spat blood into the dirt and realized that questions were dangerous things. But even as he learned to hide them, his mind refused to stay still. He watched everything. The way the overseer kept the keys to the tool shed tied to his belt, the times the patrol riders changed shifts, the direction of the river's current beyond the cane breaks. Every detail was a thread, and he was quietly weaving something with them. There were others who carried the same fire. Old Isaac, who limped from a broken leg long healed wrong, was the heart of the quarters. He had been born in Virginia before the slave coffles moved south, and he spoke of the world as though it was something bigger than what the white men claimed. "Freedom ain't new, boy," Isaac once whispered as they mended sacks under moonlight. "It's just buried deep." He told stories of those who had run before, men and women who slipped through the forests and followed the stars north. Some made it, some didn't, but each one had left a trail, invisible to the eye yet strong as scent to those who dared to follow. At night, after the horn had sounded and the fields had gone quiet, Samuel lay awake listening to the forest hum. The wind carried the smell of pine and river mud. Somewhere beyond the trees, dogs barked and chains rattled faintly from the holding pens near the cotton press. He imagined those sounds fading one day, silenced by something stronger than fear. He did not yet know that the thought itself was the beginning of rebellion. The breaking point came one August morning when a boy younger than him, called Eli, stumbled from heat and exhaustion. The overseer saw him fall and, without hesitation, swung the whip down with a rage that came too easily. The blow landed across Eli's neck, tearing the skin. Samuel moved before he could think. He dropped his bucket, his body surging forward, his hand catching the whip mid-air. The sound that followed, a gasp, a silence, the rush of breath, was louder than the whip itself. Time seemed to pause. Carter stared at him in disbelief, his face flushed with fury. The whip fell from his grasp. Samuel knew then that nothing would ever be the same. They beat him until he could no longer stand. The punishment yard filled with the scent of sweat and blood, the crowd forced to watch as a warning. He did not cry out. Each strike burned, each lash opened his skin, but something deeper stayed untouched. The master ordered him chained in the smokehouse without food or water. For 3 nights he lay in darkness, rats scratching in the corners, his thoughts fevered and wild. When the door opened on the 4th morning and light spilled across the floor, he saw Isaac standing there with a bucket of water. The old man said nothing, but his eyes carried a message. "It's time." The escape began with rain. Storms rolled across the delta that week, thunder shaking the fields, giving cover to the sound of footsteps. Samuel slipped from the quarters with two others, Isaac and a woman named Mariah, who had once been forced to nurse the master's child. She carried scars along her arms that glistened like silver in the moonlight. They moved through the cane brakes, following the low ground toward the river. Samuel's chains, once locked tight, had been filed thin by Isaac's hidden blade over many nights. When they finally broke, the sound was soft, like a breath leaving the body. He left the pieces buried beneath a tree stump. Each mile they walked was a prayer. They crossed creeks and crawled through swamp water that rose to their waists, their bodies slick with mud and fear. Dogs bayed in the distance. Once they hid in the hollow of a cypress tree while patrol riders passed, torches glowing like floating stars. Mariah pressed her hand over Samuel's mouth as his breath came fast. She whispered something, words he couldn't hear but felt. When the riders vanished, they kept moving north, guided by the faint shimmer of the North Star through the storm clouds. By the third night, their feet bled. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, but the thought of capture burned worse. They reached an abandoned shack near the Yazoo River, where they rested briefly. Isaac's strength was fading. Fever had taken hold from the swamp water. "Don't stop for me," he said, his voice ragged. "Keep that fire moving, son." Samuel wanted to argue, but Isaac's eyes silenced him. By dawn, the old man was gone, his body still, his face calm as if he had already crossed into freedom of another kind. Samuel and Mariah buried him beneath wildflowers, using their hands to move the earth. Neither spoke. The silence between them was its own kind of vow. That day they pushed farther north, closer to where rumors said the river met secret sympathizers, free men, abolitionists, and those who moved souls along the hidden road. But even as they neared that fragile promise, something darker brewed behind them. The Bellamy men had raised a posse. Bloodhounds had been set loose, their scent trailing through the mud. When Samuel heard the distant barking, he knew the chase had begun. Every step became a battle between terror and endurance. He had no map, no certainty, only the memory of his mother's voice telling him that freedom was not a place. It was this moment, this running, this refusal to turn back. As dusk fell, he and Mariah reached the river's edge, where the current roared wide and fast. The water shimmered with lightning's reflection, a mirror of chaos and salvation. Behind them, torches flickered among the trees. Ahead, the unknown waited. They waded into the water, the current pulling hard. Mariah's hand gripped his wrist as they pushed forward, the world around them dissolving into rain and darkness. Somewhere in that blur of motion and fear, Samuel felt the chains, those invisible ones that still clung to his soul, begin to loosen. He was not yet free, but he was no longer bound. As they disappeared into the river's rush, the sound of the dogs grew faint, swallowed by thunder. The storm raged on, washing away tracks, blood, and everything that once held them to the earth. In the quarters, whispers began that night, small, trembling, dangerous. The people spoke of Samuel, the boy who had caught the whip and vanished. They said he had turned to smoke or that he walked with angels now. But Isaac's last words lingered in every heart. Keep that fire moving. The field still stretched wide, the lash still cracked, but something had changed. For the first time in years, eyes lifted when the horn sounded at dawn. The cotton seemed lighter in their hands. Somewhere out there, beyond the river and the storm, Samuel was still running, and the idea of his freedom began to move like wind through the canebrakes, quiet but unstoppable. Quiet but unstoppable. The river had swallowed them whole, then released them into a different kind of silence. When Samuel and Mariah pulled themselves onto the far bank, the world felt new and hostile at once. Mud clung to their legs. Their clothes hung heavy with water. The storm had passed, leaving behind a mist that crawled low over the reeds. The moon appeared fractured, its reflection broken by ripples on the surface. For a long time they lay there without speaking, catching their breath, listening for dogs or shouts. There was nothing, only the chirp of frogs and the sigh of wind through the trees. The river had done what it always did, erased the past behind it. But the land ahead was not mercy. This was the edge of the Mississippi wilderness, dense, wild, alive with both danger and promise. They moved slowly, guided by the faint path of wagon ruts hidden under ferns. Mariah's hands trembled from cold, her lips blue. Samuel tore a strip from his shirt to bind the bleeding cut on her arm. He had never tended another's wound before. It made him feel human again, something the lash had tried to take. They found shelter beneath the upturned roots of a fallen oak, its hollow big enough to crawl inside. There they huddled until daylight returned, a pale light filtering through the canopy like the beginning of a new world. The air smelled of moss and iron. When Samuel woke, Mariah was already sitting upright, her eyes scanning the distance. She looked different now, less a figure of sorrow, more of resolve. "We can't stop," she said softly, almost to herself. He nodded. They had no map, only instinct and rumor. They knew that north lay freedom, but between them and that idea stretched hundreds of miles of rivers, swamps, and patrol lines. Still, something deeper than knowledge drove them. It was not hope exactly, but something older, a refusal to go backward. As they walked, Samuel thought of Isaac, of the quiet strength in the old man's eyes. He carried Isaac's words like scripture. Keep that fire moving. Each step was a verse, each breath a kind of prayer. They followed the river upstream, drinking from it sparingly, hiding during daylight hours when the sound of horses sometimes echoed from distant banks. Once they came across a burned clearing where the ashes of a cabin still smoldered. Beside it lay a rusted horseshoe and a torn scrap of cloth with initials stitched in white. Samuel wondered if someone else had tried to flee here long before them and failed. That night they stumbled upon a narrow trail of footprints, bare, small, leading deeper into the woods. They followed cautiously until they reached a small clearing where a cabin stood, half hidden under vines. Smoke rose faintly from its chimney. Mariah tensed, her hand gripping Samuel's wrist, but hunger had stripped fear of its power. They approached slowly, and when the door opened, an old woman stepped out, her hair white as cotton. She stared at them for a long moment before speaking. "You runnin' north or runnin' from?" Neither answered. The woman's eyes softened. "Come in then," she said. Inside, the cabin smelled of herbs and old smoke. The woman, who called herself Ruth, had once been enslaved, freed by her husband's will decades before. She lived alone now, tending a small patch of land and a hidden faith that ran deeper than words. She fed them cornmeal mush and bitter tea, listened to their story without interruption. When Samuel finished, she nodded slowly. "The river took you where you was meant to go, but it ain't the end. There's a road hidden in the woods, runs from here to the next county. You follow it, keep close to the river, and maybe you'll find the folks who help our kind move north. But don't trust every light you see. Some shine to lead you astray." Before dawn, she gave them a bundle of food wrapped in cloth and a small piece of iron shaped like a star. "Carry this," she said. "It's old, but it remembers." Samuel didn't understand, but he took it. When they left, Ruth stood in her doorway watching, the smoke from her chimney rising like a quiet signal to the sky. By the third day, the river began to curve eastward, and the land grew rougher. They crossed through fields of cane and pine, avoiding farms where white men might ask questions. Once they saw a group of chained men being led by horsemen along the road, a coffle bound for Natchez, their faces blank with exhaustion. Samuel and Mariah crouched behind a thicket watching in silence. It was a mirror of everything they had escaped, and the sight filled Samuel not with fear but with rage. He gripped the piece of iron Ruth had given him, feeling its weight. Somewhere deep inside, a thought began to take shape, not just of running, but of returning one day. At night, they found shelter near a half-collapsed barn. The air was cold and rain dripped through the cracks. Mariah spoke for the first time in hours. "You ever think about what comes after?" she asked. Samuel looked at her, unsure how to answer. Freedom was a word too large to hold. He only knew what he didn't want: to kneel, to obey, to bury another friend in secret soil. After, he finally said, "We make a world that remembers us." She smiled faintly, though her eyes were full of something harder than hope. Meanwhile, back on the Bellamy plantation, Samuel's name had become both curse and prophecy. The master's fury was boundless. He rode through the quarters shouting threats, promising punishment to anyone who had known or helped. Carter Finch led search parties for days, dragging men from their huts, demanding answers through fists and whips. No one spoke. The silence became its own rebellion. Even those who had never met Samuel began to whisper about him after dark. They said he had crossed the river by walking on the storm, that his mother's spirit had guided him north. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the idea. Lena's song, once forbidden in the fields, began to return on people's lips, soft and hidden beneath their breath. It was a song of water and fire, of chains turned to dust, The children hummed it without knowing why, and the elders smiled. The overseer tried to stamp it out, but it spread like wind through the cane. For the first time in years, there was something alive in the quarters that the whip couldn't touch. A few weeks after Samuel's escape, strange things began to happen. Tools went missing. The cotton bales spoiled in storage. One night, a section of the cotton gin caught fire, flames leaping into the sky. The master called it sabotage. The people called it the earth remembering. The rebellion was not open, not yet, but it had started in whispers in the way eyes met across the fields. Isaac's words lived on, carried from mouth to mouth. Keep that fire moving. Far to the north, Samuel and Mariah reached a small settlement near the Tennessee border. The houses were simple, wooden cabins clustered around a blacksmith's forge and a church that leaned slightly to one side. Here lived free blacks, escaped slaves, and a few white abolitionists who risked everything to keep the road alive. One of them, a man named Benjamin Cole, took them in. He was tall, gray-bearded, with eyes that held equal parts sorrow and defiance. He showed them maps drawn in charcoal, routes through forests, places where safe houses waited, rivers to cross. The line ain't straight, he said. Freedom's never straight, but it runs all the same. For the first time, Samuel saw what Isaac had meant by a trail left behind. It wasn't just roads and signs. It was people, ordinary, quiet people whose courage stitched the world together in secret. He helped around the forge, repairing tools, carrying wood, learning to read letters by candlelight. Mariah worked with the women, tending to the sick, sharing stories of the Bellamy fields. They both knew they could stay here for a while, but not forever. The road still waited. North lay Ohio, then the promise of Canada, a place whispered like heaven. But rest brought reflection, and reflection brought guilt. Samuel dreamed of the plantation, of Eli's small body in the dirt, of Isaac's grave. He saw the faces of those still bent under the sun, their songs rising in the morning haze. Each dream left him restless. The others at the forge noticed his silence. One night Benjamin said quietly, "You look south even when you face north." Samuel didn't answer. He knew what it meant. Freedom had not closed the wound. It had deepened it. When winter came, frost edged the ground and their breath hung in the air like smoke. Samuel and Mariah prepared to move again, carrying Ruth's star, a small Bible from Benjamin, and nothing else. On the morning they left, Benjamin gripped Samuel's shoulder. "If you make it north," he said, "don't forget the ones still waiting." Samuel met his eyes. "I won't," he said, and he meant it. As they crossed the frozen fields under the gray sky, a flock of crows lifted from the trees, their black wings cutting through the mist. The sound echoed like a warning and a promise. The river that had once saved them was far behind now, but its current still flowed inside him. Each step forward carried a question that would soon change everything. Not whether he could be free, but whether freedom could live without the ones he'd left behind. The road north was dangerous, lined with betrayal as much as mercy. Slave catchers rode the back roads, offering rewards for bodies alive or dead. But by now Samuel was more than a fugitive. He was a story told in whispers across Mississippi, a spark flickering in the minds of those still bound. And as he disappeared deeper into the winter woods, that spark began to glow brighter behind him, spreading quietly, patiently, towards something that would soon burn too brightly to be hidden. Hidden. Snow fell like ash from a gray sky, each flake melting as it touched their skin. The forest was a cathedral of silence, its bare branches etched against the dim light of dawn. Samuel and Mariah moved through it carefully, their breath slow and shallow, each step breaking the thin crust of frost beneath their feet. The road north had become narrower, not in distance but in safety. Every mile brought them closer to the border between the world they had escaped and the one that promised freedom. Yet the difference between the two seemed to blur with every passing day. Freedom, Samuel realized, was not a place marked on a map. It was a shadow that moved just ahead of them, leading them onward but never letting them rest. They had left Benjamin's settlement 2 weeks before, following the crude directions sketched on parchment, a winding path through woods, across rivers and through the broken ribs of forgotten towns. Sometimes they stayed in barns or cellars, sometimes beneath open sky. The world was both cruel and kind. Every stranger could be a savior or a snare. At one crossroads, they encountered a traveling preacher who offered them bread and a ride beneath his wagon's tarpaulin. His hymns were soft and strange, filled with coded words Samuel could not yet decipher. At night, as the wagon rattled over frozen ground, he realized those songs were not only for God, they were maps, carrying the memory of freedom from one soul to another. Mariah's cough had worsened in the cold, a deep rattle that woke them both in the darkness. She brushed it off with a faint smile, insisting she was fine, but Samuel saw the weariness in her eyes. He carried more of the load now: firewood, the small bundle of food, the cloth-wrapped Bible Benjamin had given them. When she faltered, he offered his arm, and together they kept moving. She had once told him that pain was a kind of memory, that their bodies carried every lash and scar like scripture. He began to understand her meaning now. Each ache was proof of survival. They reached a small town called Corinth, where a woman named Miss Tilda ran a boarding house near the edge of the woods. Her face was pale, her hair hidden beneath a bonnet, but her eyes were sharp and full of understanding. She asked no questions, only guided them to a narrow attic room where a candle burned beside a loaf of bread. "Rest," she said softly. "The Lord's road is long, but it's been walked before." Samuel realized she was one of them, not by blood or bondage, but by choice. The world, he thought, was larger than the plantation had ever allowed him to believe. They stayed 3 nights hidden beneath quilts that smelled of lavender and old paper. Miss Tilda told them stories of others who had passed through, men and women from Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana, some who made it to Canada, others who were caught and hanged in silence. Each story was a thread in a vast invisible tapestry. On the 3rd night, as wind howled outside, Miss Tilda handed Samuel a small silver cross. "For when you forget which way is north," she said. He took it without speaking, his fingers tracing the smooth metal. By the time they left Corinth, the snow had turned to sleet. The ground was slippery and the river crossings treacherous. More than once, Samuel slipped on the ice, pulling Mariah to safety. Each fall reminded them of how thin the line between freedom and death could be. They reached the edge of Tennessee and waited near a mill for a contact, a free black man named Henry who was said to guide travelers north in exchange for labor. He arrived after dark, his figure tall and broad against the lantern light. Without introduction, he motioned for them to follow. His speech was quiet, his movements deliberate. He led them to a narrow boat moored by the river. The journey upriver was long and cold. Henry rowed while Samuel kept lookout. The banks were lined with bare willows, their branches hanging like ghosts. Mariah huddled beneath a blanket, her cough echoing softly over the water. Once they saw lights on the far shore, patrol riders searching for runaways. Henry whispered, "I keep low," and they drifted silently until the torches faded. Samuel watched their reflections disappear and thought of the plantation dogs, of the sound of chains clinking in the dark. Those memories no longer frightened him. They reminded him of how far he had come. When dawn broke, they reached an old sawmill deep in the woods. Henry's brother, Josiah, lived there with his wife and 2 children. They welcomed the fugitives quietly, offering food and warmth. The children stared at Samuel with wide eyes as if he were a legend come to life. He smiled awkwardly, unsure what to do with their wonder. That night, around a small fire, Josiah spoke of the world beyond, of cities like Cincinnati and Detroit, where black men worked for wages and read from their own books. "Ain't heaven," Josiah said, "but it's a start." Mariah listened, her gaze distant. When the others slept, she turned to Samuel and whispered, "You think we'll ever stop running?" He hesitated. "Maybe not," he said finally. "Maybe freedom's just learning to keep moving without chains." She nodded, eyes shining in the firelight. "Then we already got part of it. Back in Mississippi, the Bellamy Plantation was unraveling. The master's fury had curdled into fear. Crops failed mysteriously. Tools were found broken. One night, the overseer, Carter Finch, was discovered dead beside the gin house, his throat cut clean. No one claimed to know how. The master blamed the slaves, threatening to burn the quarters if the culprit wasn't found. But in truth, something larger was moving through the land, something that couldn't be whipped into silence. The uprising began not with weapons, but with withdrawal. Men and women began to slow their labor, to spoil cotton deliberately, to vanish into the swamps for days at a time. They met in secret, deep in the cypress groves, under the cover of songs that carried coded meanings. It was said that Samuel's spirit led them, that his defiance had cracked the spell of fear that bound them. Whether or not he still lived, they believed he watched over them, that his courage had become their own. The rebellion spread quietly across neighboring plantations. passing from hand to hand like a flame hidden in the palm. One night, a patrol rider found strange symbols carved into a tree near the fields, a star above a river. The overseer dismissed it as superstition, but to those who understood it was a message. He crossed. You can too. Weeks later, Samuel and Mariah reached the outskirts of Kentucky. The air smelled of smoke and pine. They were thinner now, their faces hollow, but their eyes burned with a fierce clarity. They came upon a settlement where abolitionists hid fugitives in cellars beneath barns. Here they met a Quaker woman named Esther, whose calm presence reminded Samuel of his mother. She spoke little, but her kindness was steady as a river. She tended Mariah's cough, gave them clean clothes, and showed Samuel how to read the stars properly. Freedom's written up there, she said, pointing to the sky. You just have to learn its language. It was in that quiet village that Samuel first heard rumors of revolt in the South, plantations in Mississippi and Georgia where enslaved people had risen up, burning fields and breaking chains. He didn't know if it was true, but the thought filled him with both pride and sorrow. The fire was spreading just as Isaac had said it would, but fires always consumed before they cleansed. He wondered how many would die before freedom meant more than a word. Mariah's health began to fail. Her cough deepened, her strength fading faster than the daylight. She refused to stop. We've come too far, she whispered each morning. But her steps grew slower, her silences longer. One evening, as snow began to fall again, she collapsed by the side of the road. Samuel caught her before she hit the ground. She looked up at him, her breath shallow, eyes bright with something beyond pain. You have to keep going, she said. Promise me. He shook his head. Not without you, she smiled faintly. You will. That's what freedom means. He held her until her breathing stilled. The forest was silent except for the wind through the branches. He buried her beneath the snow, marking the spot with the iron star Ruth had given them. For a long time he knelt there, his body shaking with grief he had no words for. When he finally stood, the world seemed both emptier and larger. He turned north again, the silver cross cold against his chest. Days blurred into nights. Hunger became a companion, exhaustion a teacher. Yet he kept moving, through forests and frozen streams, past towns that turned away strangers and those that offered silent shelter. Somewhere near the Ohio River he saw the sky open wide and bright for the first time in months. He crossed that river alone, the ice cracking beneath his feet, each step echoing like a heartbeat. On the far shore he fell to his knees, the cold biting his skin. He had no words, no witness, but in that moment he felt the weight of generations lift, just enough to breathe. Freedom was not triumph. It was survival. It was the memory of those who had fallen, the promise carried forward. Samuel rose and began to walk again, toward the faint lights of a town that might take him in. Behind him the river froze solid, erasing his footprints. Ahead the wind carried the sound of distant bells, church bells perhaps, or something else entirely. He listened for a long time, then kept walking. Back in Mississippi, the Bellamy Plantation lay in ruins. The fields were black with soot, the master gone, the overseer buried. No one could say how it began or who had led it, but the story spread faster than fire itself. The boy who caught the whip had returned in spirit, and the land had finally answered him. The night that followed the storm became a quiet reckoning. In the cabins of the lower quarters, where the damp air clung to the skin and the moonlight slipped in through cracks in the wood, there was a silence that spoke of fear, but also of awakening. The old ones sat close to the fire, eyes heavy with memories, while the young ones whispered about what they had seen. The courage of Samuel, the fall of the overseer, the cries that had split the night. For years they had lived beneath the same whip, their days measured in cotton pounds and punishment, but something in the air had shifted. Fear was still there, coiled tight, but beneath it lay a trembling current of hope. Too small to name, too dangerous to voice. Samuel had run into the wilderness, yet his name lingered in every whispered prayer, carried on the breath of those who had watched him vanish into the trees. In the days that followed, the plantation moved under the weight of suspicion. The overseer's body had been dragged away before sunrise, buried hastily beyond the fields. Master Harlan arrived by noon, his face dark with rage and disbelief. He rode through the quarters with his rifle across his lap, demanding answers no one dared to give. He interrogated the elders first, his voice sharp as the edge of a blade, then turned to the young men. forcing them to stand in a line as the sun scorched their backs. No one spoke. They had seen what happened when tongues loosened, how punishment spread like fire, burning even the innocent. Harlan knew it too, and in that knowledge lay his greatest fear, the silence itself. For silence meant unity. Silence meant the slaves were no longer fractured by fear alone. Something had tied them together. Something invisible and dangerous, a shared belief that freedom was not an impossible dream. Samuel's escape became both a curse and a spark. Every patrol in the county was warned. Riders with torches combed the woods at night. Dogs howled in the distance, and the riverbanks were watched for signs of footprints. Posters appeared on nearby roads offering rewards for his capture, dead or alive. The men who hunted him spoke of restoring order. But beneath their bravado there was unease. Stories of maroon settlements hidden deep in the swamps had always been whispered. Places where the escaped lived by their own law, beyond the reach of white men. The hunters feared those stories might now be true. Samuel, they thought, could become one of them, or worse, return one night leading others. Deep in the woods, Samuel moved like a ghost. The first days were agony. His feet bled from roots and stones, his body fevered from exhaustion, and every sound, the rustle of leaves, the croak of frogs, seemed to echo the approach of pursuit. He had no weapon but a sharpened stick, no food beyond wild berries and roots, yet the forest, though cruel, offered him something the plantation never could. Solitude without chains. He learned to drink from rainwater that pooled in hollow logs, to sleep in the hollow of an oak wrapped in moss, to follow the stars as his only compass. Each night as he rested, he whispered to himself the names of those still trapped behind the fence. Moses, Clara, old Ruth, little Josiah. He did it so he would not forget why he had run. Freedom meant nothing if it belonged to one man alone. One afternoon, while moving along the riverbank, Samuel found remnants of an old camp, charred wood, scraps of cloth, the bones of small animals cleaned and piled neatly. He followed the trail cautiously and soon saw smoke rising between cypress trunks. At first he thought it was a trap. Perhaps the hunters had left a decoy to lure him out, but as he crept closer he heard singing. Low, rhythmic, and ancient, it was a sound that carried both sorrow and strength. When he finally stepped into the clearing, 3 figures rose from the shadows. 2 men and a woman, all dark-skinned, dressed in ragged clothes, their eyes sharp and weary. They were Maroons, runaways like him but older, hardened by years of surviving beyond the master's reach. At first they mistrusted him. Strangers could bring danger, but when Samuel told his story, of the lash, the overseer's cruelty, the fire in the fields, they listened in silence. The oldest of them, a man with silver in his beard named Ezekiel, nodded slowly. "You carry the mark," he said. "The mark of the one who has seen too much to go back." They took him in that night, sharing their small fire and the little food they had. In the days that followed, they taught him the ways of the hidden, how to move silently through water to mask his scent from dogs, how to make smoke invisible under leaves, how to carve snares and build shelter from reeds. They lived by the rhythm of secrecy, but also by an unspoken code. Every act of survival was an act of rebellion. As weeks passed, Samuel's body grew stronger, but his mind wrestled with guilt. He thought of the people he had left behind, the children whose eyes had followed him as he disappeared into the dark. Freedom tasted bitter when it came at such cost. Ezekiel saw the conflict in him and spoke one night beside the fire. "Freedom ain't a thing you keep," he said, staring into the embers. "It's a thing you give." One man's escape means little if the rest still bow. Those words struck Samuel like a bell in the night. He realized that his running had not ended his fight. It had merely begun a new one. Rumors began to drift back to the plantation. A patrol claimed to have found signs of encampments deep in the marshes. Another said they'd been ambushed by shadows, voices calling out from nowhere, fires snuffed before they reached them. The white men dismissed it as superstition, yet their fear was real. The slaves noticed it too. For the first time they saw their masters afraid of the dark, afraid of the woods, afraid of what they could not see. That fear gave them courage. Secret gatherings began again at night. Songs sung in low hums, prayers disguised as hymns. Samuel's name returned in their whispers. No longer just a runaway, but a symbol. Then came the message, a piece of cloth smuggled in by a peddler who sold goods at the edge of the fields. It bore a simple mark, 2 crossed sticks burned into the fabric. To most it meant nothing, but to those who knew it was a signal. Ezekiel's group was planning something larger than any had dared before. Samuel had sent the mark himself, hidden within the folds of trade cloth, trusting that his people would understand. The uprising would not be loud or swift. It would move like the wind, unseen until it struck. That night, thunder rolled across the horizon, and rain began to fall again, soft and steady. In the cabins, the slaves worked in silence, repairing tools and setting aside small bits of food. Each gesture carried purpose now. In the fields, the overseers sensed something but could not name it. They shouted more, whipped harder, demanded order where none remained. The system that had ruled them for generations was beginning to crack, not from the outside but from within. Samuel's act of defiance had become a whisper that traveled faster than any patrol could ride, reaching plantations miles away, stirring hearts that had long forgotten how to dream of freedom. As midnight neared, Samuel stood beneath the sheltering branches of the swamp cypress, watching the storm's reflection tremble in the water. The others stood with him, Ezekiel, Ruth, the young ones who had escaped after hearing his story. The air smelled of wet earth and iron. Samuel felt the pulse of something ancient moving through the dark, something larger than vengeance, larger than himself. It was the heartbeat of all who had suffered, all who had dared to believe that no chain could hold the human spirit forever. In that moment, as the rain fell harder and the horizon flashed with distant lightning, he knew the uprising had already begun, not in the swing of a blade, but in the courage of those who refused to bow. And somewhere beyond the trees, in a cabin where the fire had burned low, a mother hummed a lullaby to a child who could not sleep. The song carried through the cracks out into the night, crossing the fields like a breath of memory. It spoke of rivers and stars and a freedom that waited beyond the reach of men. Though Samuel could not hear it, he felt its echo inside him, a promise whispered by generations past, urging him forward. The path ahead would be long and cruel, but the first step had already been taken. The chains had not been broken yet, but they had begun to rust. The storm that had rolled over the Mississippi lowlands left the land trembling and alive with sound. Frogs called from flooded ditches. The cicadas sang their relentless chorus, and the swollen creeks whispered against their banks. But beneath that natural music, another kind of rhythm had taken hold, a pulse that beat from the hidden hollows of the earth, carried in footsteps and hushed voices. Samuel had disappeared into the wilderness weeks ago, yet his shadow lingered over the plantations like a ghost. The white men called him a fugitive, a murderer, a devil in the dark. The enslaved called him something else. They called him the one who broke the silence. His name passed from mouth to mouth like a secret prayer, changing as it traveled, sometimes brother Samuel, sometimes the night walker, sometimes only him, but always it meant the same thing, the beginning of something they had never dared believe possible. The fields had become quieter, but the quiet was no longer submission, it was waiting. Every glance between men as they bent over the cotton rows held a question. Every hymn sung in the quarters trembled with new meaning. The overseers sensed it but could not name it, only feeling the tension that now lived in the air. They carried their whips more tightly, barked commands louder, struck faster at the smallest hesitation. Yet even as the lash cut the air, the eyes that met theirs were no longer empty. There was something alive behind them now, something unchained within, though the iron still bound their wrists. In the distant swamps, Samuel and Ezekiel's group grew stronger. Others had found their way to them, guided by the songs and marks left along secret paths. One woman came carrying a child no older than 2, her feet raw and bleeding, her body thin from hunger. Another, a young man named Thomas, bore the scars of chains around his ankles but eyes sharp with defiance. They brought stories from the plantations, rumors that Samuel's act had spread beyond their county. In Louisiana, they said, an overseer had vanished in the night, his shack burned to the ground. In Alabama, a group of men had been caught whispering of rebellion and hung before dawn. These were fragments of something larger, scattered sparks, distant yet connected by the same fire. Samuel listened to these tales in silence, his face carved with exhaustion and thought. Freedom had given him no peace, only purpose. He knew that the time for whispers was drawing to an end. Each night, as the firelight flickered against the black water, he mapped the land in his mind, the roads, the rivers, the slave patrol routes. Ezekiel watched him, knowing what grew behind his quiet eyes. "You planning to go back?" he said one evening, voice low and steady. Samuel did not answer at first. He stared into the fire, watching the wood collapse into embers. "Ain't no back," he finally said. "Only forward." When the moon turned full again, Samuel began to move. He left the camp before dawn, his pack light, his resolve heavy. The others wanted to follow, but he told them to wait, to guard the hidden ones, to spread the word only when the sign came. He would go to the quarters first, to the people who had seen him run, to the fields where his blood had once mixed with the soil. If they rose together, it would not be in rage alone, but in remembrance of all who had suffered in silence. Ezekiel clasped his arm before he left. "The night's your cloak now," he said. "But don't forget, the dawn listens too." It took Samuel 2 nights to reach the plantation again. He moved like smoke through the trees, unseen, the land itself seeming to guide his steps. The fences, once a prison, now looked fragile, almost absurd against the vastness of the dark. He approached from the western edge where the river cut close to the fields. The cabins were silent, the faint glow of dying fires inside them. He tapped 3 times on the side of the first one, a rhythm that meant, to those who knew, "I live." Inside there was a rustle, then a gasp. Moses opened the door, his face pale in the moonlight. For a moment neither spoke, the silence between them filled with everything words could not hold. Then Moses stepped aside, and Samuel entered the place he had once called his cage. They gathered quietly in the shadows, faces half lit by the trembling flame of a single candle. Clara was there, her eyes wide with disbelief and awe. Old Ruth sat near the wall, her hands clasped tight, whispering prayers beneath her breath. Samuel told them of the woods, of the others who had escaped, of the freedom that waited beyond the river. He spoke not as a preacher but as a witness, his voice steady, his eyes fierce. "They call us property," he said. "But property don't bleed, don't dream, don't fight. We've been fighting since the day they stole us. Now it's time they see what that fight looks like." That night a plan began to form, not of open battle, for they had no weapons, but of disruption, of slow rebellion. They would work the fields as before, but at night they would break what they could, the tools, the carts, the plows. They would spoil the cotton bales, pour water into the grain stores, set fire to the overseer's quarters when the time was right. It would not bring freedom in a day, but it would send a message. The system was no longer unbreakable. The courage of one had become the will of many. Days turned into weeks, and strange accidents began to trouble the plantation. Tools vanished. Mules broke free from their tethers, fences fell overnight. The overseer who replaced the last was nervous, quick to anger, but the more he punished, the less control he seemed to hold. The slaves no longer cried out beneath his whip. They stared at him with eyes that made his hands shake. Even the white men who rode the patrols began to sense the shift. "Something's wrong out here," one said to another as they passed the dark line of the forest. "They're watching us now." Samuel moved between worlds, by day hidden in the woods, by night slipping into the quarters to guide the quiet war. The songs they sang grew louder, no longer disguising their defiance. The children began to hum them while carrying water, the elders murmured them while pretending to pray. Freedom had become a rhythm, a heartbeat shared among hundreds, and though no guns fired and no armies marched, the South trembled. Fear spread faster than truth. Plantation owners met in town halls, speaking of insubordination, outside agitators, northern influence. But the rebellion they feared was not from the outside. It was born in their own fields, among the very people whose humanity they had denied. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late October, the air thick with the scent of harvest. Samuel and a small group from the quarters had gathered near the edge of the cane fields, torches hidden beneath damp cloth. They had planned to strike at midnight, to burn the overseer's barn and flee before the flames drew attention. But as they waited, a sound broke through the silence, the bark of hounds, distant but growing nearer. Someone had spoken. Someone, terrified or coerced, had betrayed them. Panic rippled through the group. The young ones wanted to scatter, but Samuel raised his hand. "No," he whispered. "We finish what we started." He tore the cloth from his torch and struck the flint. The flame burst alive, a fierce orange glare cutting through the dark. He tossed it into the dry hay piled against the barn wall. In seconds, the fire leapt upward, roaring like an animal freed from its cage. The others followed, their torches igniting the night in defiance. The hounds' cries grew louder. the riders shouting behind them, but the slaves did not run. Not at first. They watched the flames climb, watched the sky turn red, watched the symbol of their servitude burn. Only when the first gunshot cracked did they flee, scattering into the woods, hearts pounding, lungs burning, alive with something they had never felt before. Power. By dawn, the fire was still smoldering, a blackened ruin of ash and smoke. The plantation was chaos. Master Harlan stood before the wreckage, his face ashen, his hands shaking with fury. He saw in the ashes not just loss, but the collapse of control. If one group could rise, others could follow. The rebellion had no clear leader now, no central plan, yet it spread like rumor on the wind. In nearby counties, slaves refused orders, refused punishment, refused to bow. Whispers of Samuel's name carried through the forests, along river paths, through the quarters of the enslaved. He had become more than a man, he was a story. A story could not be chained, could not be whipped, could not be killed. As the sun climbed that day, Samuel watched from the cover of the trees, his chest tight with both grief and triumph. He knew what would follow, the raids, the punishments, the blood. Yet he also knew that something irreversible had been set in motion. Freedom might not come in his lifetime, but it had taken root, deep and defiant. The wind carried the smell of smoke across the valley, mingled with the faintest hint of rain. Samuel closed his eyes and let it wash over him. Somewhere behind the pain and the fear, he could feel the promise that one day, the land itself would remember their struggle, not as rebellion, but as the first breath of liberation. The days that followed the fire at Harlan's plantation were soaked in dread. The air itself seemed to thicken, carrying the metallic scent of ash and the sour stench of fear. In the county seat, church bells rang at noon, not for prayer but for assembly. The white planters gathered beneath the steeple like men convened for war. Their coats were still damp from the morning rain, their boots stained with soot. They spoke of restoring order, of making examples, of burning out the rot before it spread. But behind their talk of discipline lay panic. The rebellion had not been an organized army, not even a siege. It was worse than that. It was invisible, born from silence, spreading through rumor, through songs, through eyes that no longer looked down. They could not shoot a silence. They could not hang an idea, but they could try. By sunset, the riders were already in the fields, armed with rifles, torches, and dogs. The scent of fear guided them more surely than any trail. They rode from plantation to plantation, dragging men and women into the open, demanding confessions that had no answers. Some were whipped until the skin peeled from their backs, others locked in smokehouses with no food or air. Yet no one spoke Samuel's name aloud. The few who had seen him vanish into the woods swore they knew nothing. Even under pain, the people held their silence, an act of defiance more dangerous than fire. At Harlan's place, the overseer's barn was still a ruin, black and skeletal against the dawn. The fields were littered with footprints, some deep and desperate, others calm and deliberate, as if those who made them had walked into the night with purpose. Harlan stood there, his coat open, his face drawn, staring at the horizon where the woods swallowed the light. He had built his world on control, measured in acres, in bodies, in obedience. Now, for the first time, he faced something beyond the reach of his whip. He felt it in the way his hands trembled, in the way the dogs refused to go near the edge of the swamp. The woods no longer belonged to him. They had become a kingdom of the lost, ruled by a ghost named Samuel. In those same woods, Samuel moved cautiously, every sense sharpened. The night of the fire had scattered his people. Some fled east toward the river, others north to the deeper swamps. He had stayed behind to watch what followed, to see what price his act would exact. He saw the torches in the distance, the search parties crawling across the land like fire ants. He knew what they would do to those who remained. The thought burned him, yet he also knew that retreat now would mean surrender. Freedom had been paid for in suffering long before him. He could not stop what had begun. On the third night after the fire, Samuel found his way back to Ezekiel's camp. The older man was waiting, his face lit by the faint glow of embers. "You done what they said couldn't be done," Ezekiel murmured. "But now the earth's hungry for the price." Around them, the others sat in silence, faces gaunt, eyes hollow. Some had lost family in the raids. Others had narrowly escaped the dogs. Samuel listened, guilt gnawing at his chest, but Ezekiel's words held no accusation. "You gave them something they can't take back," he said. "Now they'll tear the land apart trying to bury it. As weeks passed, the countryside bled. The white militias swept through villages and fields, punishing anyone suspected of sympathy. Some plantations lost half their workers to hangings and disappearances. The newspapers spoke of Negro insurrections and savage uprisings, printing false accounts that made the fear worse. Even those who had never lifted a hand were punished. Yet, for all their cruelty, the masters could not erase what had been set loose. The songs persisted, now softer, slower, sung in code. The people worked as before, but their obedience had turned into endurance. Their minds had crossed a line the chains could not pull them back from. Samuel became a myth by necessity. The hunters could not catch him, though they swore they had seen him, sometimes near the marshes, sometimes crossing a river under moonlight, sometimes standing on a ridge before vanishing into mist. The stories grew wild. Some said he had been shot and risen again. Others claimed he could speak to the spirits of the dead, that the woods obeyed his steps. Samuel himself heard these tales whispered by those who found him, and he never denied them. He understood what the truth could not achieve alone, legend might. A man could be broken, but a legend could not. He began to move beyond his county, guided by the river and the compass of starlight. He sought out other runaways, other hidden camps, other sparks waiting for wind. In the lowlands of Georgia, he found a band of Maroons who had lived in the cypress swamps for over a decade, building hidden farms beneath the fog. They greeted him cautiously as one who had drawn too much attention, but when he spoke, of courage, of unity, of the fire that had burned more than a barn, they listened. "You bring trouble," one man told him, "but trouble been our shadow since birth." They offered him shelter, food, and something more, trust. In return, Samuel taught them what he had learned: how to move messages through field hands, how to use hymns as codes, how to make silence a weapon. Through winter, he traveled like a phantom. The land grew cold and frost settled over the ruins of rebellion. The masters believed they had restored control, but the quiet that returned was not submission. It was patience. Every Sunday in the slave quarters across counties, men and women gathered after dark, singing softly of Jordan rivers and promised lands. The songs carried Samuel's story like scripture, each verse reshaping him into something more than mortal. In their hearts he became the spirit of deliverance, proof that resistance was not madness but destiny. One evening, Samuel found himself on a ridge overlooking a small settlement near the edge of the river. The smoke from the chimneys rose straight into the pale sky, the fields barren from the cold. He thought of the people still there, bent beneath the yoke, and wondered how many believed he had died. A longing rose in him, not for home, but for purpose renewed. He had seen freedom's face, but it was lonely. Freedom without justice was a ghost that haunted him. He went down to the water and knelt. His reflection trembled beneath the ripples, half man, half shadow. He thought of his mother, of the lullabies she used to hum through cracked lips. He thought of Moses, of Clara, of little Josiah, names that had carried him through hunger and fear. He swore then that his story would not end in hiding. If he must vanish, let it be as fire does, leaving light behind. By spring, the patrols had lessened. The men who once hunted him grew weary, their rewards unclaimed, their fear dulled by time. But the legend of Samuel continued to move, whispered in the fields, told by travelers, embroidered into the fabric of resistance. A preacher in Savannah spoke of him as the Lord's deliverer. A fugitive near the Natchez Trace claimed Samuel had led him through the woods, though the man could not say whether he had been flesh or spirit. In every telling, Samuel's story became less his own and more the people's, reshaped, sanctified, unstoppable. Ezekiel, now old and frail, watched the change from afar. "He ain't just run now," he told the younger ones. He became the road itself. The camp grew quieter as new fugitives came and went, each carrying fragments of the legend into the world beyond. They left marks carved into trees, signs on rocks, songs that could guide the lost through the swamps. Samuel's presence lingered in all of them, though no one could say where he was. Some believed he had gone north, joining the underground railroad that wound its secret path to freedom. Others swore he still walked the southern woods unseen, watching, waiting for the next spark. One humid evening, as fireflies blinked like scattered embers, Ruth, the woman who had once prayed for Samuel's soul, stood by the river near the ruins of the burned barn. She was old now, her back bent, her hands rough from years of labor, but as she listened to the frogs calling across the water, She felt a strange peace. The land that had once been soaked in cruelty now seemed to breathe differently. It was as if the earth itself remembered him, the boy who had run, the man who had fought, the ghost who had refused to die. Ruth began to hum. The tune was slow, heavy with longing. It was the same song Samuel's mother had sung long ago in the cabin before dawn, the one about the river that carried souls home. As she sang, others joined her one by one, their voices rising softly through the dark. There were no chains now in the sound, only memory and defiance. Somewhere deep in the forest a breeze stirred, carrying the melody northward. Samuel, wherever he was, would hear it. Samuel, wherever he was, would hear it. The wind carried the smell of ash and rain over the Georgia pines that morning, the final dawn of the world Samuel had known. Smoke from the burned fields clung to the air, drifting like ghosts above the charred cane. The plantation stood hollow now, stripped of its order, its voices, its cruelty disguised as routine. In the distance, the great house was only a blackened shell, its windows blown open by the heat of the night before. The uprising had begun as a whisper in the dark, a spark in a world soaked in fear, and now its echoes were rising across the lowlands. But in the center of it all stood Samuel, not as the frightened boy who once bowed beneath the overseer's whip, but as something else. Something forged in pain and belief and defiance. His heart beat not with panic now, but with the strange rhythm of freedom that no master could silence. The night before, when the fire took the cane fields, Samuel had stood on the ridge and watched the flames spread like a tide. The plan had been desperate, born not from certainty of success, but from the certainty that to do nothing was to die slowly. It was the choice every enslaved soul had faced since the first ship landed, a choice between chains and silence or the brief, bright blaze of resistance. The men and women who joined him were not soldiers. They were people who had known nothing but the grind of forced labor, the weight of overseers' guns, and the hollow prayer of endurance. Yet in their eyes, Samuel had seen something unbreakable, a memory of freedom buried so deep it had survived generations of theft. Now, with dawn creeping across the ruined fields, he walked through the smoke with their faces burned into his mind. Some had fled into the woods after the chaos, seeking the swamps and the safety of distance. Others had fallen, shot or beaten down in the night when the patrols arrived. The world would not remember their names, but Samuel carried them like sacred scripture. He thought of Ruth, who had sung the old songs in whispers when everyone else was afraid. He thought of Isaac, whose laughter had once filled the cabins and who had died laughing in the face of his captors. And he thought of Anna, who had pressed a small carved cross into his hand before they ran, saying, "If you live, carry us with you." The cross was still there, rough wood worn smooth between his fingers. He moved through what remained of the quarters, splintered timbers, ashes, a silence that felt older than time. Somewhere beyond the hills the militia would be gathering. The men who owned this land and others like them would descend with blood in their eyes and vengeance in their hearts. Samuel knew what they would do when they found what was left. He knew the story they would tell, the story of savages and slaves, of property gone wild, of punishment deserved. They would not speak of the whip or the hunger or the chains. They would not mention the children sold south or the family split like livestock. They would erase everything but the fire, and they would call it madness. That was how history had always been written here, in the ink of the powerful on the backs of the voiceless. But Samuel understood something the masters never had. Stories could survive even without paper. The truth could hide in song, in whispers, in the lines carved into memory. Somewhere, somehow, others would hear of what happened here. Not the official account, but the secret one, carried by those who fled north through the night. Perhaps one day, long after he was gone, a child would hear the name of a man who had escaped the chains and refused to bow again. Perhaps the courage born in these burning fields would become more than vengeance. It would become proof that even in bondage the human spirit was never entirely owned. He turned toward the forest where the air was cooler and the shadows thicker. The path ahead was uncertain, the way north long and perilous, yet in his chest a quiet voice whispered that he was not alone. The others who had escaped before him had left traces, hidden roots through the marshes, marks carved into trees, fragments of code passed from plantation to plantation. The underground was not just tunnels or safe houses. It was an invisible current, made of people who refused to forget what freedom meant. Somewhere out there others were waiting, men and women who risked their lives to guide the fugitives toward the promise of new soil. Samuel would have to find them, trust them, and keep moving. As he walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the plantation faded behind him, the crackle of dying fire, the distant cries of men searching for survivors. He crossed a creek swollen with rain, mud pulling at his feet, the water washing away the soot and blood that clung to him. For a brief moment, as the current swirled around his legs, he thought of baptism, the old sermons he had heard in secret, the ones that spoke of deliverance through water and faith. Maybe this was what that had meant. Not salvation promised by another man, but the cleansing that came when you took your destiny back into your own hands. By midday, he found the others. A small group had gathered in a hollow beneath a stand of cypress. Men, women, even a few children, all weary and hollow-eyed but alive. They looked to him not as a leader now, but as a witness, someone who had survived the night they thought would destroy them all. He said little. There were no speeches left to give, no strength for glory. Instead, he helped tend the wounded, shared the little food they had scavenged, and listened to the silence between them. Every so often, a baby cried or someone whispered a prayer. Beyond that, the forest was still. As dusk fell, a thin mist rolled in from the river. They built no fire, fearful of being seen. Instead, they huddled together beneath blankets of moss and damp cloth, drawing warmth from one another. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, long and mournful. Samuel sat awake, watching the stars appear through breaks in the canopy. Each one seemed sharper now, brighter, like distant fires burning in defiance of the night. He thought of his mother, of the stories she used to tell about ancestors who had crossed the great ocean chained and nameless, yet who had carried the spark of life through every horror. That spark, she had said, could not be killed. It could only change form, waiting for its moment to rise again. When the first light broke through the trees, Samuel knew it was time to move. They followed the river north, staying to the shadows, sleeping during the day and walking at night. They scavenged berries, caught fish with their hands, and avoided every road and settlement. Some days it felt like progress, other days like wandering in circles, but even when their bodies trembled with exhaustion, none of them spoke of turning back. The world they had left no longer existed, and what lay ahead, freedom or death, was still better than the silence of submission. Weeks passed like that, the days melting into one another, until the seasons began to shift. The air grew colder, the nights longer. They met strangers along the way, a freed man who gave them bread and pointed them toward the mountains, a preacher who hid them in his church cellar, a farmer's wife who risked her life to leave a lantern in her window as a sign. Each act of kindness felt like a miracle, a reminder that even in a land built on cruelty, humanity could still flicker through the cracks. By the time they reached the Tennessee border, only half of them remained. Illness and pursuit had taken the rest. Samuel had stopped counting the graves, yet the dream carried them forward. When at last they reached the small cabin hidden in a thicket near the river, a known station on the Underground Railroad, a woman opened the door and whispered, "You're safe now." Samuel nearly collapsed at her feet. For the first time, he allowed himself to breathe without fear. That night, as he lay wrapped in a rough wool blanket, he felt the weight of all that had happened settle over him. The uprising, the fire, the deaths, they were no longer just tragedy. They were testimony. He realized that survival was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of another. He would live to tell what had happened, even if only in fragments passed quietly from one heart to another. He would become the keeper of a truth too dangerous to write down, but too powerful to let die. Years later, when the war finally came and the old order began to crumble, whispers of Samuel's name still moved among the freedmen. Some said he had joined the Union lines as a scout. Others said he had gone west, helping other fugitives find their way north. No one knew for certain, but in the fields where the cane once grew, people spoke of a night when the slaves rose and the world trembled, if only for a moment. And they said the fire that burned that night had never truly gone out. It had simply changed form, waiting for its next spark. In time, the plantation was rebuilt, then abandoned, then reclaimed by the forest. The stones of the big house crumbled, vines swallowing what was left. But beneath the soil, beneath the roots and ash, something remained. The memory of those who had dared to rise, of those who had believed that courage could exist even in the darkest place. And when the wind moved through the pines, it carried the faint echo of a song once forbidden, a song of freedom and defiance, rising like smoke toward the sky. And somewhere, in that eternal wind, young Samuel's spirit walked unbound, unbroken and forever free.